Hello there, welcome back to Backyard Ballistics. Today we're taking care of a very old weapon, a Steyr model 1912. This is probably the oldest firearm I've ever shown on the channel, being marked 1916. By looking at it, I can tell that the rusting that happened is quite different from that of my previous two videos. In this case, the layer of corrosion products is quite thin and the rust color is somewhat desaturated. This suggests that steel got corroded in a relatively mild environment for quite a long time. However, let's not get too optimistic. Guns of this age have often gone rusty more than once in their lifetime, and I can already tell that there's quite some damage on the slide. Another big issue regards the grips. They are pitch black and definitely shouldn't be of that color. I'll have to bring them back to their original look and take the occasion to talk a bit about some wood related chemistry. Anyway, this gun is not really stuck and was actually covered in oil when I got it. I degreased it before starting to film to show the real entity of corrosion, since oils tend to hide the extent of it. That's why it looks bone dry now. When we get these relics, we rarely have time to work on them straight away or at all, so we cover them in oil and put them in storage for when we'll retire. Thanks to your support on Patreon, I can take the time to do it now instead of waiting for when I'm 70 and give these guns some of the care they deserve. As I'm disassembling it, check how different this gun looks from the semi-auto pistols we're used to nowadays. In the first couple decades of the 20th century, handgun engineering was evolving rapidly, and designers came out with all sorts of different design solutions, of which only a handful survived to our days. This pistol is short recoil operated, just like most modern ones, but the way the barrel unlocks from the slide is not very common, managed by this set of cam couplings. But we'll look at the functioning later on. Now, with the gun field stripped, I'm removing the transfer bar, hammer and safety lever. And here a very big difference from what we're used to nowadays shows up. This design uses a fixed magazine instead of a detachable one. This is of course less practical compared to today's standards, but had the big advantage that you couldn't lose the empty magazines, which was seen as a major logistical challenge. Anyway, here come the magazine plug together with 3 leaf springs, the rearmost of which is the hammer spring. Then the magazine spring and the cartridge follower. The way I'm gonna be getting rid of rust will be different depending on the original finish of the part. Those that were originally blued will be boiled, and those who were white will be derusted in a citric acid bath. Let's focus on the blued parts first, which are the frame and the slide. After scratching the loose oxides, I was met with a sad surprise. This gun definitely got red other times in its past, and in a much more damaging way than last time. I tried to save it, but it's definitely not going to look new again. Let me give you another useful insight. This area here on the slide has a very rough pitting filled with large, hard and dark lumps of corrosion products. These take very long to form and are a good giveaway that the aging of the gun was genuine and not artificially sped up for the making of a YouTube video. And I'm sorry to burst a bubble, but a lot of restoration content here on YouTube is faked. There are at least 2 very large YouTube channels that only post fake content and that I'm sure you've watched at some point. Content reliability is a huge problem of our time. I'm currently working on a guide for spotting unreliable restoration content, while for unreliable news stories I'll pass the torch to Ground News, which kindly offered to sponsor this video. Ground News is a website and app that not only aggregates breaking news from tens of thousands of sources around the globe so that you can compare how the same story is covered by different sources, but also tells you which sources are politically biased and gives each of them a factuality ranking, allowing the reader to evaluate the reliability of each article on a specific subject. You'll see that many news events are covered very differently depending on where the news outlet lies on the political spectrum, and discover which details are emphasized, exaggerated, or left out entirely by each source. What I find most interesting are the so-called blind spots. Certain news stories are not covered at all by sources that are on one side of the political spectrum. Look at this one as an example. Germany to keep last 3 nuclear power plants running in policy U-turn. This is the largely predictable outcome of an ill-fated energy policy that was set up more to keep a political consensus rather than using science-backed rationale. And of course, this realization doesn't suit the political side that exploited it, so news outlets from that side are completely ignoring what actually is an important news to cover. Also, notice how most headlines suggest that the decision is already taken, while the higher factuality Reuters reports that it's just being considered for now. Ground News is one of the sponsors that I'm most proud of, and I suggest you try it out for free at ground.news/backyard or subscribe to get unlimited access for a much more transparent news experience. Going back to our Model 12, what I'm going to be doing is a rough 80 grit sanding to get rid of the top layer of material, which is the roughest one. The deeper pits, however, especially those on the side of the slide, are way too deep to be sanded away. Anyway, I'm dodging the markings, which I painted in red to be sure I don't accidentally sand them over. An important thing that I haven't said before is that you can't expect to get a good flat surface when using an abrasive wheel, even a buffing wheel. They'll inevitably tend to transfer their round shape to the surface they're grinding, so you'll end up with rounded corners, concave surfaces instead of flat ones, and weird-looking markings. If you want to keep a surface flat, you need to grind it with something flat, unless both the part and the wheel are secured and moved within a machine. Convex surfaces can be kept that way using abrasive cloth or paper in a shoe-shining fashion, and only concave surfaces can be processed with an abrasive wheel. Once I get to an acceptable surface, I then start using finer and finer abrasives, but no finer than 600 grit. Actually, in hindsight, I should have stopped at 400. Getting such a pitted surface to a shine will actually make it look worse. Probably pinning it would have given better results though. Anyway, now I need to blue it, and if you've watched my other videos, you know that I have a favorite rust bluing solution that I make myself, and that is very easy to make. However, many people have been asking if I could suggest an even simpler way that didn't require carrying out chemical reactions. So I decided to show you the crudest yet effective way of producing a rust bluing, which is a form of fume bluing. The key concept of this is exposing the parts to the fumes of hydrochloric or nitric acid, or a mixture of the two. Hydrochloric is way easier to find than nitric though, so I'm showing that. Ideally, you want to do the fume exposure in a controlled manner into a box where you put a few shallow containers with the liquid acid in them, and you keep the parts in for a time that ranges from several seconds to a few hours depending on the strength of the fumes. In my case, I just felt lazy and instead blasted everything with the fumes coming out of a concentrated acid bottle, which is the crudest way of doing it. The advantage of this technique is that the fumes get even into hard to reach areas effortlessly, while with traditional rust bluing you need to reach every surface with a swab. Depending on the strength of the fumes, which in my case was very high, the time required differs, and for me just a few seconds of exposure to the fumes were enough, after which the parts are simply let to rust naturally. After about 8 hours, a coat of rust had formed, and I boiled the parts as usual. Here's the result. As you can see, the metal got noticeably darker, and repeating the process 4 or 5 times will get us to the desired finish. Of course, using a fume box would aid in consistency. I, however, got a bit impatient since it's been almost 2 months since my last video, and I had to get this one out as soon as possible, so I finished the job with my zinc ammonium chloride solution, which requires less passes. And here's the final result as I'm oiling the surface. The barrel of these guns wasn't blued, so I just gave it a light sanding and polish to get rid of the dull appearance. There's nothing I can really do about the deeper pits. Notice all the protrusions that are present on the barrel and that are required for the barrel locking mechanism to work. If I used a buffing wheel on this barrel, I would mess up their corners badly. Something that was already messed up was unfortunately the barrel bore. After brushing and wiping, this bore is probably the worst I've ever shown on this channel, although definitely not the worst I've ever fired. I don't see any structural damage, but the rifling is partially compromised. I do not expect this to be a particularly accurate firearm, but we'll see. Now, all the metal parts are de-rusted and refinished. The only thing missing are the grips, on which I want to focus a bit more in depth than in my previous videos. They are black, almost ebony-like, but they're instead made of European walnut. They should be brown. However, wood tends to get darker with age, and there are at least 3 ways for it to get dark. First of all, it could be that the wood itself didn't get darker, but the finishing product did. This is common with straight linseed oil finishes, for example. The next way of darkening is through actual chemical degradation of certain molecules in the wood, usually through exposure to UV rays from sunlight and oxygen. Finally, wood can get darker colored when exposed to alkaline environments. Look at this simple experiment. I've got 3 different types of wood. From left to right, we've got fir, willow and walnut. I'm brushing them with a dilute solution of sodium hydroxide. On fir, almost nothing happens. The wood appears a bit darker, mainly because it got wet. On willow, which at the beginning was even lighter colored than fir, we see a pronounced darkening where the solution is applied. Finally, on walnut, the change of color is so strong that it almost turns into black. Here you can see the same samples after they were rinsed and dried, and the results speak for themselves. This is due to the presence of tannins in the wood in different concentrations. Soft woods typically have a low amount of them and do not discolor much in alkaline environments. Hardwoods, on the other hand, with a few notable exceptions like beech, all contain a substantial amount of tannins. They are large organic molecules that darken in color when exposed to alkaline conditions and do the opposite when exposed to acids. Have you ever noticed that tea gets lighter colored when you add lemon to it? The acidity of the lemon juice lowers the pH, causing tannins to change color. Following the same idea, I will try to acidify the wood of my grips and see if this changes anything. But before doing that, let's get rid of the original finish and all the dirt and grime that piled up over more than a century. I'm using a paint stripper, which is essentially a very active mixture of solvents in gel form. After letting it sit for a few minutes, I scrape it out of the checkering with a nylon brush. Now that the surface is mostly clean, it looks a bit less black, but I definitely need to also act on the wood itself. The first thing that I'm gonna try, as anticipated, is treating it with an acid to see if we can lighten the color of tannins this way. I want to avoid any acid that could form insoluble precipitates like oxalic acid that would remain trapped and cause finishing problems later on. So I'm using a dilute solution of hydrochloric acid, which has the added benefit of evaporating without leaving any residue. What I'm doing here is nothing new. It's been known for centuries that hydrochloric acid can remove certain stains from hardwood floorings, for example, but now you know why it works. Anyway, after treatment, I let the grips dry and we can clearly see a fair improvement. What we notice, however, is that the right grip is still much darker than the left one. That often has to do with the fact that one side got a different exposure to the elements, for example because the gun spent many years rested on the same side. In this case, the only thing I can do is to decompose some of the chemicals responsible for the darker color. To do this, I'm using a mixture of hydrogen peroxide, which I've diluted to about 20%, and concentrated ammonia solution. This is quite a nasty mix and requires great care to protect the skin against it. It is a non-storable mixture and a small amount needs to be prepared right before use. I don't have an exact ratio since I normally add ammonia dropwise until the solution starts fizzing gently and then apply it to the wood. Ammonia allows the peroxide to decompose more readily, attacking the color-bearing compounds in the wood. I need to be careful with the timing though, since this solution acts fast and it's very easy to overbleach. I only treated the right grip and corrected the color slightly on both, getting to this result, which I think is acceptable. As for the finish, once everything is dry, I'm using 3 coats of True Oil, a commercial product that I'm sure you've heard about. It's a hybrid varnish and oil finish, somewhat similar to the mixture of spar varnish, turpentine and boiled linseed oil gunsmiths used before these pre-made products became available. I also think it has dryers that speed up the polymerization of the oil. The result is reasonably waterproof and does not darken with age, hopefully. Anyway, here's the finished result, together with all the metal parts that I had to refinish. Next problem, getting the ammunition. This gun is chambered in the now obsolete 9x23mm Steyr cartridge. Finding factory ammunition for it is out of the question, but even finding the appropriate brass is hard, and with the current shortages around the globe, that would have taken way longer than I could afford. I had to make my own brass, starting from something that was close enough, slightly longer and that I had at hand. The best way would have been trimming a 38 special to length and turning the base on a lathe to match the dimensions, but I felt that would have taken too long. Somebody wrote on Wikipedia that you can trim a 556 to length, but rifle brass is much thicker, so internal dimensions would be messed up. Also, the rim would be too small, so that's definitely not a good way. I could have necked up 763 Mauser, which would have required making a purpose-built die, but since I needed to get this video out as soon as possible, I again went with the lazy alternative. I took 38 super brass and reduced the rim diameter to the correct value. The only issue with this method is that the case is about half a millimeter shorter than it should, and this can cause headspace problems, including overstressing the extractor. However, I already knew from experience that this worked okay on this model, so I risked it. Before going to the range, let me briefly show you how this interesting design works. When the gun is in battery, the barrel is locked to the slide, with its protrusions engaging the corresponding recesses on the slide. Upon firing, the whole group recoils backwards for a short distance, after which this cam on the frame causes the barrel to rotate about 20 degrees. This in turn causes the barrel to unlock from the slide that can keep moving backwards to complete the reloading cycle, while the barrel stands still against the frame, waiting for the slide to come back under spring force. When the slide is opened on an empty magazine, it remains open and cartridges can be fed into the gun from above, but not before using the safety lever to lock the slide in place, or you get a miniature Garand thumb. In case you want to unload your gun, all you have to do is push on this slider, and that's probably the most spectacular way of unloading a firearm ever. The trigger pull is atrocious, over 10 pounds, which was a common feature of these guns. And that is clearly not helping with accuracy. These are 3 different targets that I got at 25 meters, that is 27 yards. There are some flyers out of the main grouping, and some of those holes are elongated, which suggests an insufficient stabilization, probably due to the worn-out barrel, but it's still an acceptable result for a 106-year-old gun. Once again, a huge thanks goes to my patrons, which as usual are all listed here. Thank you all for watching, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'll see you next time. Bye.